The BYU Cougars absolutely demolished the Kansas Jayhawks. A historic performance on the BYU basketball has never done before. We saw it all on display Tuesday night. And just how good could this BYU squad become by the end of the season? We're discussing all that on POSTCAST.
You are Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast on the BYU Cougars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? I'm Jake Hatch, your host here on Locked On Cougars, resident BYU insider. Thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day, and more importantly, thank you to all of you who are everydayers with us right here on your original daily podcast focused on the BYU Cougars. Special edition postcast here as BYU absolutely demolishes the Kansas Jayhawks 91-57. Never in my wildest dreams, as I was headed back from Las Vegas, many of you know I was down there for a long weekend with my daughter at a cheer competition. Never did I expect when I sat down after driving back in from Vegas this evening to sit down on my couch, tune into ESPN, and watch BYU absolutely just wipe the floor with the Jayhawks. Bill Self has never absorbed as big of a loss as he absorbed against BYU Tuesday night. Conversely, BYU's never beaten a ranked opponent worse than they did in this game. It's remarkable what BYU accomplished in this contest, and it's a credit to Kevin Young and the entire BYU basketball program. It's crazy to think, remember, they made 10 three-pointers in the first half of this game, speaking of BYU, and by halftime, they're up 20, and you could kind of see the body language of Kansas walking off the court was like, yeah, well, thanks for coming. It did not look good. And you could tell Bill Self was upset about it. He called his final timeout he had available to him with 11 minutes to go in this game. That's how bad it was. BYU is putting reserves in this game in the final 10 minutes of the contest. It was as thorough a beating as you're going to see in college basketball. And the remarkable part about this is a Kansas team. Was it 2 months ago? They beat Duke, Cooper Flagg, and the Duke Blue Devils on a neutral court. I don't know what's up with Kansas, but they got beat by Utah on Saturday, and then they come into BYU and just fall apart. Tony Jones from the Salt Lake Tribune pointed out on Twitter, I think, he said that this looks like a team that doesn't really like each other right now, speaking of Kansas. They, for whatever reason, they didn't like anything about being in Utah this whole weekend because they absorbed two major losses. They're 23rd. They're going to drop out of the national rankings. And this once vaunted Kansas Jayhawks squad that had aspirations of making a run in March Madness, national title, all that stuff, that's all up in the air. With regards to BYU now, how far can BYU climb? Because I didn't get a chance Saturday to talk about the Kansas State win, and that was a very impressive victory for BYU. But the more impressive thing is, did the BYU football program kind of point to BYU basketball and say, hey, learn from our mistakes? Remember, BYU struggled with one of the hottest teams at the time when they lost to Kansas on that fateful night the week after that Utah game. Well, BYU basketball, I think, paid a little attention and said, hey, you know what? We're not going to trifle with any of this. And they went out there and made sure to take care of business. I didn't expect after they beat Kansas State for this to be as thorough a beating as it was for BYU, but look at the stats for this. BYU for the night, 38.9% from three. And like I said, 10 of those came in the first half. They were 10 of 24. They really kind of just cruised in the second half. Kansas never made any serious push to really try to get back into this game. It felt like they settled way too often for threes. Didn't want to close out on BYU shooters. Kansas shot 9 of 32 from three, 28.1%, 36.5% overall from the field. BYU was north of 50% for most of the second half. For the entire game, 51.5%. This is pure domination from BYU to do what they did to the Kansas Jayhawks. And Kevin Young, take a bow. There was something they saw on their film review, whatever they saw after the Utah game, that they felt like, hey, we're going to exploit this. And they made Kansas look absolutely silly. I unfortunately, like I said, I got home from Vegas a little too late to make it down to the Marriott Center. I missed out. I truly did. Watching the scenes unfold on ESPN made me think, you know what? I needed to get down to that game. But hey, regardless, a very, very thorough beatdown for BYU and sets them up now to continue to climb when it comes to the national rankings. Because here's the thing. After you beat Kansas State and Kansas, I'm going to have a hard time trying to think why BYU shouldn't be ranked. Now, you follow that game up against Kansas. You got a huge showdown this Saturday at Arizona, 19th ranked Wildcats, 8:00 game on ESPN. Could you take down two top 25 ranked teams in the same week? That would be a pretty monumental task for BYU to accomplish that. But considering the run BYU's on right now, is anybody going to count them out of having a chance to do just that? That's the other part about this. There'll be payback on the mind for BYU going up against Arizona, after losing 85-74 here in Provo. But I remember when BYU lost Arizona and Cincinnati back-to-back, it was like, okay, where's this BYU team going to dig deep and find something? Well, they found something at West Virginia. Then they come home, take care of both Kansas schools, and now they're flying high. The rest of the way for BYU, there are real two major games. And obviously the one Saturday at Arizona, then you're at Iowa State in early March. Those are the two toughest games on paper, but you do have a road trip at Arizona after you play at Arizona State. After you play Arizona, you have to face off against West Virginia once again, and then you finish it up against Utah, who, like BYU, is putting together a late case to make the NCAA tournament field. But the bigger point to be made here for BYU basketball is that everything is shaping up for BYU to really kind of climb in the standings here. So let's get to some of these comments real quick. Let's see. Oh, we got a lot of good ones here. Geez, you guys weighed in with thoughts. So great question here from Ashton. Can you ask Coach why Cannon Catchings didn't play late in that game? It's a great question. Cannon's been a guy with the expanded lineup that when he's hot, he's being left on the court. But when he is not playing at his peak capacity, they're putting other guys on the court. Trey Stewart, Mihailo Bošković. Any of you who saw it right after the game, you had Kevin Young on ESPN with Scott Van Pelt, and he's saying, hey, we've expanded all of our roster and the rotation to allow extra guys to play, and we're even playing faster than we were. And I think it was on full display against Kansas. The Jayhawks, they had no interest whatsoever in being a part of this. It was just such a crazy thing to watch them just fall apart. And like I said, it was not them not trying. They just simply gave up. You made them say uncle or quit, whatever term you want to use. That's what BYU did to this Kansas Jayhawk team. Let's see. Jason Sainsbury. I've been to the woodshed before, but that one felt great. It did. It was really, really impressive. David Chase, maybe it was the cold. Okay, let's be honest. It can get pretty darn cold in Lawrence, Kansas. Much colder than it gets in Utah because they have humidity to deal with. But the other thing about it is you look at it, and it's just a really, really impressive win for BYU. Son of Neil says this. The team finally feels like they're coming together. This is the team we all knew they could be. This is why we were all frustrated seeing them lose to Utah the way that we did. It's not a bad point. This is a team. They have had loads of potential ever since day one. But the biggest thing was kind of putting it all together. And who knew that? I remember when Kevin Young, he cut down that rotation. Bošković and Trey Stewart were glued to the bench. Against West Virginia, they called upon those two, and they responded emphatically. And that 10, 11-man rotation, it's here to stay. I don't think any way you can cut down any more than what BYU did with the rotation right now. And very few teams can operate the way BYU's operating right now and continue to win basketball games. But Kevin Young, he's found the answer. And that's a credit to him as a coach, but also a credit to the BYU players themselves being unselfish, knowing that, hey, playing time across the board, maybe cut a little bit as we expand the roster, or it's not the roster, expand the rotation a bit. But the net benefit is we're winning basketball games. That's the thing about this with this BYU team is there's a lot of unselfishness going on. And I really, really enjoy this. Yellow Martian, I just caught the last 3 minutes. Holy crap. We've got last 3 minutes. The last 5 minutes of the game was garbage time. So no offense, Yellow Martian. You missed out. The first half really was I guess you want to call it competitive for BYU basketball. That first half. That's when it was somewhat competitive. The second half, like I said, it was on cruise control. And it's really, really impressive to watch this BYU team kind of come into their own. But it doesn't get any easier. As I mentioned, they head to Arizona Saturday. And I don't know what to expect from this BYU basketball team because, once again, at the outset of this conversation, I said that I didn't know what to expect from BYU coming into tonight. When I sat down on my couch, I spent a long weekend in Vegas with my daughter. Got home, sat down. It's like, all right, let's see how BYU does in this first half. And all of a sudden they come out gunning. Trevin Nell hits a big three early. And you're like, okay, that's a good tone setter. Then they start just making three after three after three, 10 of them in the first half. And you're like, man, they're just going to bury Kansas. That's exactly what they did. 801 West Valley, Kaba swatting that ball into the stands. Let's go. He did have that volleyball spike late in this game. They sent it into the crowd. Yeah, Braille says it's 2 degrees in Kansas City right now. So the cold is not the problem for this Kansas Jayhawks team. But Blind Man says depth helps. I'm glad BYU doesn't need just one guy to win a game. It really is. It's as impressive a win as you're going to see. And in fact, downright historic, as I mentioned. BYU's never beat a ranked opponent worse than they did. And conversely, in the illustrious history of Bill Self at Kansas, he has never had a worse loss on his coaching record. Remember, BYU went to Kansas last year and shocked everybody with that win out there in Lawrence. What an incredible win that was, but this was equally, if not more impressive, just the way that BYU just flattened Kansas, never let them get off the deck. Preston, it felt like Kansas just completely gave up with 10 minutes to go in the game. It really did kind of feel that way. So, huge win for BYU. We'll have more thoughts on this as the week progresses, getting you ready for the Arizona showdown on Saturday. That's not going to be easy for BYU, but the nice part is they got a ton of momentum behind them as they get ready for this Arizona game. But once again, a big thank you as always for joining us here on this live edition of POSTCAST. We will have a full edition of the podcast tomorrow. I'll be back in action finally from a long weekend. We'll talk plenty of BYU football and some additional basketball thoughts as well. But until then, thank you as always for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. And once again, thank you for being everydayers with us right here on the Locked On Cougars podcast.